Okay, so the usefulness of the grid really becomes apparent when we begin defining new cells. So cells actually get defined in terms of rows and columns. So you need to think about the rows and the columns that are in the grid. Now to define the rows and the columns on the grid, I'm going to introduce one other type of property syntax. We call this complex property notation. And it's useful when you need to set a value on a property that is more complex than a simple string will allow. There are a lot of properties where a simple string actually makes a lot of sense. These are things like a number or a string or even an enum, something like the orientation property where the value is just horizontal or vertical. There are times, however, when you want to set a more complex value, like a collection of objects, as the value of a property. So the column definitions and row definitions properties on the grid are an example of this. So let me show you what it looks like to add a complex property to the grid. Okay, so this might look like a child of the grid. But the fact that it begins with grid dot is our clue that we're not adding a child, but setting a property on the grid. And the property that we're setting is the property called column definitions. Now, column definitions is a collection of objects of type column definition. And each column definition that we'll add to this collection will create a new column in the grid. Now, by default, there's one already created for us. And that's why our grid initially had just one cell, because by default, there was one grid and one row. But we can add multiple column definitions here. And we do that by simply adding a tag called column definition. So let's add a couple of these and we can see how it affects our grid. So now when I hit F5 to refresh, watch what happens. Okay, so you can see that it's moved all of the content that we had in our grid over into that first column. Now you might be wondering where exactly the column definitions are. So it turns out the grid has a really handy property called show grid lines. And if we set that to true on the grid, it will actually draw lines for us where each of the columns lie. So let's do that. And then if we hit F5 to refresh, now you can see that we actually have 3 columns defined in there, and you can see the boundaries of each one. Now, I can't imagine that you would ever want to ship an app with this turned on, but it really is super useful for figuring out what's going on as you debug the use of your grid. So to understand what's going on with these columns, let me show you what happens when we resize the grid. And I'm going to do that by resizing the window that the grid is placed in. So you can see that as we resize that window, that the column definitions are each continuing to get an equal amount of space assigned to them.